Night swallowed the frontier town whole. Dust and silence hung thick under a sky crowded with stars. A single carriage waited in the dark alley, horses restless, wheels already set to roll. The boarding house door cracked open. Iron hands locked around her wrists before she could speak. A damp cloth slammed over her mouth. Sweet, sharp, wrong. She clawed and kicked. The world tilted, soft and gray at the edges. Somewhere behind them, black smoke clawed at the stars. Flames were already eating a barn. Horses screamed into the wind, a sound that would stay in a man's chest for days. The man across from her checked his pocket watch. Unhurried, certain. 20 minutes to the station. Oil lamps burned low on the empty platform, waiting for a train that would take her far beyond any rescue. She dragged in one last breath to scream. The wheels began to turn. The wind smelled like dust and sun-scorched wood. Just dust. And horses. And something burning far off, mesquite maybe. Somebody's supper fire catching the last of the afternoon. Addie Marsh stood on the platform at Larkspur Station, with her trunk beside her like a coffin nobody had buried yet. The letter was still in her hand. She hadn't let go of it. Couldn't. Her fingers had gone stiff around the paper, and the paper had gone soft around her fingers, damp from her own palm. Miss Marsh, I regret to inform you. That was as far as she'd gotten, before her eyes stopped tracking the words, and just stared at them instead. Regret. He regretted, as if she were a parcel delivered to the wrong address. As if nearly a week on trains, and every last dollar her family didn't have were a small inconvenience he was sorry to have caused. She was 23 years old. She had $11 sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt, because her mother had told her never to keep it all in one place, not out west, not with strangers on trains. She had a name that used to mean something in Boston, Marsh. Her father's family had built ships once. Now her father coughed blood into a handkerchief, and her mother took in mending, and her little brother needed medicine that cost more than they had, which was the whole reason she was standing here, which was the whole reason she'd answered an advertisement in a newspaper from a man she'd never met, in a territory she couldn't have found on a map before last spring, promising to be a good wife, a capable wife, a wife who didn't ask for more than she was given. And now the wife wasn't wanted. Simple as that. The station agent had already gone back inside. He'd given her one look, the kind of look you give a dog that's been left tied to a post. Sorry, miss. Happens sometimes. Then he was gone, and the door shut, and the platform was just her, and her trunk, and the sun coming down like it had a grudge against her specifically. She should cry. That was what a person did. But something in her had gone very quiet, and very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes, and she thought, if she let herself cry now she might not stop, and there was nobody here to stop for. So she didn't. She straightened her spine instead, fixed her bonnet, looked out at the town of Larkspur, Arizona Territory, which consisted of one dusty street, a handful of buildings squinting against the heat, and absolutely no sign of Charles Whitmore, the man who was supposed to have married her by sundown. You waiting on someone? The voice came from behind her, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud, because it wasn't used to being ignored. Addie turned. A man, tall, dust on his boots up to the ankle, a hat pulled low enough that she had to tip her chin to find his eyes, and when she did, they held that particular gray-blue a sky takes on right before weather moves in, restless, unreadable, a color that changed depending on how the light hit it. No, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. It appears I was waiting on someone. Past tense. His mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. Not yet. Whitmore's bride. Not a question. A fact he already knew, the way you know the sun's going to set. I was, Addie said. He's decided otherwise. She held up the letter just slightly, like evidence in a trial nobody was going to hold. The man's jaw tightened, just for a second. Then it smoothed back out like it had never happened. Fool, he said. I beg your pardon? Whitmore. Fool. He said it plain, like a fact about the weather. Man sends for a bride, from Boston, doesn't even meet her at the train. Addie felt heat crawl up her neck, because it was one thing to know she'd been rejected. It was another thing entirely to have a stranger say it out loud, plain as anything, like it was just true, and everybody could see it. "You have the advantage of me," she said. "You know who I am. I don't know you." Nathaniel Cole. He touched the brim of his hat, barely. Ranch about 5 miles out. The bar C. "Well, Mr. Cole." She lifted her chin another inch. "I appreciate the introduction. But unless you're in the business of transporting abandoned brides back to civilization, I don't see how you can help me." Something flickered behind his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or something else entirely. She couldn't tell yet. Didn't know him well enough yet to read him. Wouldn't know him well enough for a long time yet. Though she didn't know that. Not standing here. Not with the sun beating down, and her whole life sitting in a trunk that suddenly felt very, very small. "I've got a wagon," he said. "Boarding house is 3 streets over. I could take you. No charge. Just an offer. Plain as the man himself. No smile behind it, that she could see, no angle, nothing sliding underneath the words looking for a way in. And still something in her hesitated. Because a woman alone doesn't climb into a stranger's wagon. Because that was rule number 1, drilled into her, before she'd even left Boston. Before she'd even known what half the rules out here would turn out to be. Because sensible women did not do this. Except sensible had gotten her exactly nowhere. Sensible had put her on trains for nearly a week, with a man's promise folded in her pocket, and sensible had left her standing on a platform with that promise torn up and thrown back at her, and if she was going to start making foolish choices, she thought she might as well make her own. Before she could answer, footsteps. The station agent again coming back out onto the platform, calling to her like she was a piece of freight he'd forgotten to log. "Miss Marsh. Train back east comes. Through at 9 tomorrow morning. Mr. Whitmore's already paid the fare." Something in Addie went very cold. Paid the fare. As if that settled it. As if she were a package being returned to the sender, refund enclosed, no further correspondence necessary. She looked at the agent, looked at Cole, and something in her, some small hard thing, that had been sitting quiet her whole life, waiting, woke up. "Thank you," she said to the agent, in a voice that could have frozen the whole platform solid. "I'll consider my options." Cole was already reaching for her trunk. "Wasn't a question," he said to the agent, not unkindly, just final. Then to Addie, quieter, "Boarding house, whenever you're ready." She was ready. She'd been ready the moment that letter hit her hand. The wagon smelled like leather and horse and sun-baked wood, and Addie sat very straight on the bench seat, with her hands folded in her lap like she was at church, because if she didn't hold herself, that way she thought she might come apart at the seams right there in front of a stranger, and that was not a thing she intended to do. Not today. Maybe not ever. Cole drove without speaking for a while. The town fell away behind them, one street, a handful of storefronts, a church steeple that looked freshly painted and defiantly hopeful against a sky that didn't care one way or the other. Then it was just scrub and rock and distance, more distance than Addie had ever seen in her life. Distance that didn't end at a building or a fence or anything at all, just kept going until it met the mountains, and the mountains kept going until they met the sky. "It's not what I expected," she said finally. Not to him exactly. More to the horizon. "What did you expect?" "I don't know." She turned the question over. "Something smaller, I think. Boston is all walls. Here there's just," she gestured, helpless, "everything. Takes some getting used to. I imagine a great many things will." He glanced at her. Just once, sideways, quick, like he was recalibrating something. "You're not what I expected either," he said. "And what did you expect?" "Crying, mostly." Addie let out a short laugh, before she could stop it, surprised at the sound of her own voice doing something other than trembling. "I considered it," she admitted. "I decided against it. Crying wouldn't get me on a different train, and it certainly wouldn't get Mr. Whitmore to reconsider his very poor judgment." "No," Cole agreed. "It wouldn't. Silence again. But a different kind now. Not the brittle kind from the platform. Something looser. Can I ask you something, Mr. Cole? Nathaniel's fine. Nathaniel, then. She tested the name. It fit oddly in her mouth, too familiar for a man she'd known 20 minutes. And yet. Why did you stop? At the station. You didn't know me. You didn't know me anything. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. When he did, his voice had changed. Lower. More careful. Didn't like the way it looked, he said. Woman standing alone with a trunk and a letter like that. Didn't sit right with me. That's not an answer. That's a reason to feel sorry for someone. It isn't a reason to offer them a ride. He glanced at her again. Longer this time. You're sharp, he said. I'm told that's part of what disqualified me. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile. Something underneath where a smile would eventually live, if she gave it time. Whitmore's a fool, he said again, like it bore repeating. They didn't go straight to the boarding house. She noticed it a mile before she said anything, the road bending wrong, away from the direction the agent had pointed, out toward open country instead of back toward the cluster of buildings that made up the town proper. She sat up straighter. Mr. Cole, this isn't the way to the boarding house. No, he agreed. Then where? I've got a proposition for you. He said it plainly, eyes on the road, hands steady on the reins, no drama in it at all, which somehow made it worse, made it realer. You can tell me no. Wagon'll turn around either way. Addie's pulse picked up. I'm listening. I run cattle. Need a housekeeper. House hasn't had a woman's hand in it in. He stopped. Started again, the sentence changing shape halfway through like he'd walked into a room and found it occupied. In some time. And a woman living alone on my land, unmarried, that's trouble in a town like Larkspur. People talk. Talk turns into something worse, sometimes. He kept his eyes forward. So, if you're willing, folks think you're my wife. In name. Nothing more than that unless you want more than that, and I'm not asking for more than that. The wagon will found a rut. Jolted. Addie's hand shot out to grip the bench seat, and for one absurd second, that was the only thing she could focus on. The wood under her palm, solid, real, while the rest of her mind scrambled to catch up to what he'd just said. A wife. In name. You're asking me to lie, she said slowly, to an entire town. I'm asking you to survive somewhere safe, until you decide what you actually want. He glanced at her again, and this time he held her eyes longer than was strictly polite, long enough that she felt it somewhere under her collarbone. Nobody's holding a gun to you, Miss Marsh. Train's still there tomorrow morning. Whitmore already paid for it. You want to go home, go home. I don't have a home to go back to, not one that wants me returned. She hadn't meant to say that. It came out of her before she could stop it, raw, true, and she felt her face heat, with the shame of having said it out loud to a man she'd met 20 minutes ago. Nathaniel didn't say anything for a moment. Then stay, he said. Simple as that. Housekeeper's wages. Room of your own. And if anybody in town asks, you're Mrs. Cole, and that's the end of it. Addie looked out at the land rolling past, gold and rust, and green in patches, where the creek must run, mountains standing patient in the distance like they'd been waiting 100 years, and could wait 100 more. She thought about Boston, about her father's cough, about her mother's hands, red and cracked, from other people's mending, about Charles Whitmore's handwriting, tight and careful, regretting to inform her. She thought about the $11 sewn into her hem, and how far that would get her and how far it wouldn't. Terms, she said. Nathaniel's eyebrows lifted, just slightly. Housekeeping wages, she went on. Paid, not implied. My own room with a lock if you don't object. And the arrangement ends the moment either of us wants it to end, with no hard feelings and no obligation. Those are my terms, Mr. Cole. For the first time, since she'd met him, Nathaniel Cole smiled. Really smiled. It changed his whole face, cut years off it, warmed something in his expression. that had, until then, stayed carefully banked down. "Done," he said, and the wagon rolled on toward a ranch she'd never seen, a life she hadn't planned, a name that wasn't hers, yet somehow already settling over her shoulders like a coat 2 sizes too big that she was going to have to grow into. The Bar C came up out of the land the way honest things do, no grand gate, no announcement, just a house of squared logs and stones standing solid against the horizon, a barn beside it, a scatter of fences holding in nothing she could see yet. It wasn't grand. It wasn't the crumbling shack she'd feared either. In the 2 seconds she'd allowed herself to imagine the worst. It was just a place, waiting to be lived in properly. A man came out of the barn, as the wagon rolled to a stop, older, weathered, the kind of face that had spent 40 years arguing with the sun and mostly winning. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Addie with open, unhurried curiosity. "Raphael," Nathaniel called, setting the brake. "Come meet Miss Marsh. She'll be staying on. Housekeeper." Raphael Ortiz approached, and something in his expression told Addie he'd already heard some version of the story, or would within the hour, and had already decided not to make it his business. "Señorita," he nodded, polite, careful. "Mrs. Cole," Nathaniel corrected, easy as breathing. "For anyone who asks." Raphael's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. That was all. Then he nodded again, deeper this time, and something passed between the two men that Addie couldn't read yet. Trust, maybe, built up over years she hadn't been there for. "Welcome to the Bar C, Señora," Raphael said, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, like he understood exactly how strange this new title sat on her, and found it, if not funny, at least interesting. "Thank you," Addie said, and meant it more than the polite words usually carried. Nathaniel carried her trunk up to the porch. Set it down at the door with more care than the wood probably needed. "It's not much," he said, and there was something almost apologetic in it. The first uncertain thing she'd heard from him all day. Been some time since it had a woman's hand in it. "You said that already." "Guess I did." Addie looked at the door. At the house beyond it, unknown, waiting. At the mountains behind it, patient and enormous. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I grew up in 3 rooms with 6 people and a leaking roof. I promise you I can make do with whatever this is." He looked at her a long moment, something in his face working, deciding something. "Nathaniel," he said again. "Nathaniel." She let it sit in her mouth this time, didn't rush past it. "I'm Addie. If we're to be married in name, I suppose you should call me that instead of Miss Marsh." "Addie," he repeated, testing it the way she'd tested his name in the wagon. It fit better than she expected it to. He pushed the door open, stood back to let her through first into the house that was, as of that morning, hers to run and unmake and remake however she saw fit. The first thing she realized standing on that threshold that had actually belonged to her, even a little, even borrowed since she'd stepped off the train. The house was simple. A main room doing double duty as parlor and dining space, a stone hearth at one end, a solid table at the other, a handful of chairs that didn't match and didn't need to, a bookshelf with maybe 24 volumes, mostly practical, cattle, horses, 1 battered medical guide, and, tucked among them, a single novel with a cracked spine that made Addie feel a small, unexpected pang of recognition. "Kitchen's through there," Nathaniel gestured. 2 bedrooms down the hall. Mine's at the end. Other one's been storage a while, but there's a bed under it somewhere. "I'll manage," Addie said, and meant it. She spent that first afternoon taking inventory the way she'd been taught. Flour, beans, salt pork, a sack of coffee, potatoes gone soft with sprouting eyes. Not much. Enough. By the time Nathaniel and Raphael came in from the last of the day's work, she had beans and cornbread on the table, nothing fancy but hot, and she watched Nathaniel stop in the doorway and just look at it for a second too long. Like the sight of a table set and waiting was a thing he'd half forgotten how to expect. "Didn't have to do that," he said. "Should have given you time to settle." "I prefer to be useful," Addie said, and didn't add the rest of it, that being useful was the only thing keeping the fear at the edges of her mind from closing all the way in, that if her hands stopped moving, her thoughts would go straight back to that platform, that letter, that word, regret, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Might not be ready for a long while. They ate mostly in silence. Not an unkind silence. Just the quiet of two strangers, and one very tired evening, feeling out the shape of a life none of them had planned that morning. Afterward, while Addie washed dishes in the basin, Nathaniel lingered at the table longer than he needed to. "Thank you," he said, "for the meal. Been a while since there was one waiting." "You keep saying that. A while since this, a while since that." Addie glanced at him, over her shoulder, more curious than she meant to sound. "How long is a while, exactly?" Something closed in his face. Quick, like a door pulled shut, before she could see what room was behind it. "Long enough," he said, and rose from the table and said good night, and left her standing at the basin, with her hands in cooling water, and the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that she just brushed up against something, with a raw edge to it. She didn't push. Not that first night. But she noticed. Filed it away the way she filed away everything, the exact shape of the silence, the exact place his voice had gone flat. She was good at noticing. She was starting to think one of the few things she'd carried west that hadn't been damaged in the crossing. Her room, once she was alone in it, was small and crowded, with someone else's forgotten things. A saddle in need of mending, a stack of crates, a trunk that wasn't hers. But there was a window, and through it, the last of the light was draining out of the sky, over the western mountains, gold going to rose going to a deep, bruised purple, and Addie sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and finally let herself feel the whole weight of the day land on her at once. She didn't cry. She'd promised herself, standing on that platform, that she wouldn't, and some stubborn, prideful part of her intended to keep that promise now too, even with nobody watching, nobody to perform for. But she sat very still for a long time, hands folded in her lap, and thought about her mother's face, when she'd left, and her father's cough, through the wall at night, and Charles Whitmore's tight, careful handwriting, and the way Nathaniel Cole's voice had gone flat, and closed over a single unanswered question at the supper table. A while. Everyone had a while, she thought. Everyone was carrying one. She just didn't know. Yet how long his was, or what had put it there, or that she'd spend the better part of the next several weeks slowly, carefully, without meaning to, working her way toward the answer. She unpacked what little she'd brought, 3 dresses besides the one she wore, her mother's silver hairbrush, a small daguerreotype of her family taken 5 years back, when her father still had color in his face, and her brother was still small enough to be held. She set the picture on the crate beside the bed, angled so she'd see it first thing in the morning. Then she blew out the lamp and lay in the dark, and listened to a house she didn't know, yet settle around her, different creaks than the ones in Boston, different silences, and somewhere far off, a coyote called, and she flinched at the sound, before some old, practical part of her mind informed her, calmly, that it was just an animal, not a threat, and she should go to sleep. She did not go to sleep for a long time, but eventually she did. Morning came loud. A rooster she hadn't noticed the day before, crowing like it had personal business with the sun. Cattle somewhere in the distance, a low, constant sound she'd have to learn to stop hearing, before it stopped waking her. Addie lay still for one disoriented moment, the ceiling wrong, the light wrong, before the whole of yesterday came rushing back, the platform, the letter, the wagon, the name that wasn't quite hers yet. Mrs. Cole. She dressed quickly. Plainest dress she owned. Hair pinned back hard and practical. If she was going to be a housekeeper, she intended to look the part, even if the rest of it, the wife part, the pretend part, was going to take considerably longer to settle into. Raphael was already in the kitchen, coffee going, and he greeted her with a nod that had already, in the space of one night, become almost familiar. Buenos dias, senora. Pause testing. El Jeef's out checking the north pasture. Said to tell you he'll clear the rest of your room this afternoon. Thank you, Raphael. Addie looked around the kitchen in the honest light of morning. A cracked window pane patched, with paper, cupboard doors that didn't sit flush, worn spots in the floor shaped like decades of other people's footsteps. Is there a routine I should know? For meals? Breakfast at sunup, supper at sundown. He handed her a cup of coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in. Nathaniel, he eats fast. Doesn't say much at the table. Don't take it personal. I hadn't planned to. Raphael studied her a moment, something considering behind his eyes. He's a good man, he said, quiet, like he was offering it as information she might need later. Just careful. With people. Has been for some time now. There was that word again. Sometime. Never a number. Never a shape she could hold on to. Addie wanted to ask. The question sat right at the back of her teeth. Ready. She didn't ask. Not yet. The days took a shape. Not an easy shape, not at first, but a shape. Addie up before the sun, coffee and eggs, and a kitchen that slowly, stubbornly began to feel less like someone else's, and more like something she was building with her own 2 hands. She learned the chickens, learned which hen pecked, and which one didn't, learned the particular ache in her shoulders, that came from a full day of work, that had nothing to do with sitting properly in a Boston parlor. She learned Nathaniel Cole in pieces, too. Small ones. The way he took his hat off before he came, through the door every time without fail, like his mother had drilled it, into him young, and it had never once occurred to him to stop. The way he ate like a man who'd once gone hungry, and never quite trusted a full plate to still be there tomorrow. The way he'd go quiet, sometimes mid-sentence, and she'd watch something pass behind his eyes, quick, private, before he pulled himself back to whatever he'd been saying. She noticed. She always noticed. One evening, near the end of the second week, she was hanging wash on a line strung between 2 porch posts, when she saw him standing at the edge of the yard, looking up toward a rise behind the house. Just standing there, hat in his hands instead of on his head, which she'd never once seen him do. She didn't mean to watch him. She told herself that later more than once. She'd simply been hanging linens and he'd simply been standing there, and it was only chance that she happened to look up at the exact moment his shoulders dropped, just slightly the way a man's shoulders drop when he's carrying something he's stopped trying to hide from himself, even if he's still hiding it from everyone else. He didn't see her. She let the moment pass, went back to the wash. But that night, over supper, beans again. She needed to learn more than beans. She thought, needed to press Raphael for more of his mother's recipes. She found herself watching Nathaniel's hands instead of his face. Steady hands. Capable hands. Hands that had built this house up out of nothing, or close enough to nothing, and yet. Raphael mentioned you've owned this place a while, she said, careful, testing the water the way you test a creek crossing, before you commit your whole weight to it. Before that, though, where were you? Missouri, Nathaniel said, easy enough. Left at 16. Worked cattle for 10 years, before I had enough saved to put down on land of my own. That's a long road. Long roads build a man. He said it plain, no self-pity in it, just fact. Or break him. Depends on the man. Which were you? He looked up at her then. Really looked the way he had once or twice before, that assessing look that made her feel, briefly, like the only thing in the room worth his attention. Still finding out, he said. It wasn't an answer. Not really. But it was closer to true than most answers she'd gotten, from anyone in her whole life, and she let it sit there between them, unpushed, and something about that, about not pushing, about letting a man keep his silences, until he was ready to hand them, over himself, settled a little more trust, into the space between their 2 chairs at that table. It was Raphael, in the end, who told her the shape of it. Not on purpose. Not really. They were in the garden, the 3rd week, wrestling weeds out of a patch of ground that had clearly once been tended, with love and then abandoned for a long time, the soil good underneath, the way Nathaniel had said, but choked over with neglect. Raphael worked beside her, with the patient efficiency of a man who'd done this exact task 100 times before, on this exact ground. This was hers, he said, out of nowhere, not looking up, from the weeds. The garden. Sarah's. Wife of the man who owned the land before. Addie's hands stilled. Before Nathaniel? See. Good woman. Grew enough here to feed the whole crew, sold extra in town besides. Raphael pulled another weed, tossed it aside. Fever took her. her husband, their boy too, all in one winter. That's terrible. That's the land. He said it without cruelty, just weariness. The weariness of a man who'd buried more than one thing in this soil, and made his peace with it a long time ago. Takes as much as it gives. Nathaniel bought the place off their daughter, back east. Couldn't bear to come herself. Addie sat back on her heels, looking at the garden, with new eyes, not neglected ground anymore, but ground that had been mourned over, walked away from, and picked up again by a stranger who'd bought a dead family's dream, and tried to make something of it. He's had losses of his own too, hasn't he? She said. Not quite a question. Raphael's hands stopped. He looked at her for a long moment, weighing something, deciding. That's not mine to tell, Senora, he said finally, gentle but firm, a door closing with care instead of force. You want to know Nathaniel Cole? You ask Nathaniel Cole. I have. He doesn't answer. Then maybe, Raphael said, going back to the weeds. You haven't asked the right way yet. She found the graves 3 days later. Not on purpose or not entirely. She'd taken to walking the rise behind the house in the evenings, after supper, when the light went gold, and the whole valley seemed to hold its breath, before the dark came down. She liked the quiet up there, liked the view of the ranch spread out below, small and solid and, increasingly, hers in some way she hadn't expected to feel this soon. The fence was small, weathered gray wood, 3 crosses inside it, simple, no names carved, that she could read, from a distance. She approached slowly. Read the names when she got close enough. William Davis, Sarah Davis, Thomas Davis, beloved son. The dates beneath told her the boy had been young. Younger than she wanted to think about too hard. She was still standing there, working out the shape of the story Raphael had half told her, when she heard boots behind her on the dry grass. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. She'd learned the particular rhythm of his walk by now, unhurried, deliberate, a man who never seemed to be in a hurry to get anywhere except maybe away from whatever he was thinking about. Didn't know you'd found this place? Nathaniel said, coming up beside her. His voice was careful, guarded in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Raphael told me a little. I found the rest myself. Addie kept her eyes on the crosses. I'm sorry for what happened to them. Wasn't my doing. Was here before me. He said it too fast, like a man deflecting a blow he'd expected, from a different direction. That's not what I meant. She turned to look at him now. I meant I'm sorry you carry it, whatever it is you're carrying. I've watched you carry it for 3 weeks now, Nathaniel, and I'd be a poor housekeeper if I hadn't noticed the man of the house flinches every time somebody says the word wife. He went very still. For a long moment she thought she'd overstepped. Thought he'd close the door the way Raphael had watched him close it 100 times before, and she'd never get another inch closer than this, and the whole rest of her time at the Bar C would be lived alongside a man who kept every door in himself locked and bolted. Then he exhaled, long, like something in him had been holding its breath for years, and had finally decided to let go. Her name was Clara, he said. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere below, one of the horses called out, restless, and settled again. We were to be married. A few years back now. His voice had gone rough at the edges, careful, like a man walking on ground he wasn't sure would hold his weight. She took sick that same winter the Devises did. Fever went through the whole valley that year. Took half the county with it, near enough. I'm so sorry. I wasn't even here. He said it fast, like he needed to get the worst part out before he lost the nerve. Was up in Tucson selling cattle. By the time word reached me, and I got back, he stopped. Started again. By the time I got back, there wasn't anything left to do but bury her. Addie didn't say anything. Didn't reach for him, though something in her wanted to, badly. She'd learned enough about this man in 3 weeks to know that comfort offered too fast, too easy, would only make him retreat further. So she just stood beside him. Let the silence hold what it needed to hold. Bought this land not long after, Nathaniel said finally, quieter now. Told myself it was a fresh start. Maybe it was. Maybe I just wanted somewhere far enough from Tucson that I wouldn't have to walk past the places we used to. He shook his head, cut himself off. Doesn't matter now. It matters, Addie said. It matters that you loved someone enough, that losing her still sits with you even years on. That's not weakness, Nathaniel. That's just what loving someone costs sometimes. He looked at her then, and something in his face was so raw, so unguarded, that Addie felt her own breath catch in her throat. Why are you telling me this? He said. Not quite a question. More like he was asking himself as much as her. Because I asked, Addie said simply. And because I think you've been waiting a long time for somebody to ask right. Something moved through his expression. Surprise, maybe, or something closer to relief. Like a man setting down a weight he'd carried. So long he'd half forgotten it was optional. You're a strange one, Addie Marsh, he said. And there was warmth in it now, real warmth. The first she'd heard directed at her instead of just at the ranch, or the cattle, or the work of the day. So I've been told. By a man who ultimately decided he preferred a different sort of wife. Whitmore, Nathaniel said, with something that might have been the beginning of a laugh, is a fool. I've said it before. I'll say it again as many times as it takes to sink in. You may need to say it a great many more times, Mr. Cole. I was quite thoroughly rejected. It takes some undoing. Then I'll say it every day if I have to. He didn't mean it the way it landed. She was fairly sure of that, fairly sure it was meant as simple kindness, a friend's reassurance, and nothing more. But something in the way he said it, low, certain, looking right at her instead of out at the darkening valley, made something in her go tight in a way that had nothing to do with grief at all. She looked away first, out at the ranch below, lights just starting to show in the kitchen window, where she'd left a lamp burning. We should go down, she said, before it's full dark. Should, Nathaniel agreed. Didn't move. Neither did she, for another moment. Just the two of them, standing beside 3 weathered crosses on a hill, each of them carrying a while of their own, and for the first time, since she'd stepped off that train, Addie Marsh didn't feel quite so alone in carrying hers. They went to town together the last week of that first month, a wagon full of empty flour sacks, and a list Nathaniel had scrawled in a hand that looked like it belonged to a man more comfortable with rope than with pen. Addie had her own additions to make to that list: fabric, thread, seed for the garden she'd started clearing in earnest, and something in her fluttered nervously the whole ride in, though she couldn't quite name why. Maybe because this was the first time Larkspur would see her as anything other than the bride Whitmore threw back. Maybe because now she'd be Mrs. Cole, in front of everyone. The town looked different in daylight bustle than it had on that first terrible afternoon, wagons and riders, storefronts open, a kind of ordinary, unremarkable liveliness that Addie found she was grateful for. Nobody here knew yet what to make of her. That felt briefly like a kind of freedom. It didn't last. Well, I'll be. A heavy-set man lounging outside the saloon straightened as their wagon rolled past, a grin spreading slow and ugly across his face. Cole picked up Whitmore's leftovers. Addie felt her spine go rigid, felt heat flood up her neck. Beside her, Nathaniel's hands tightened on the reins, just slightly, just enough that she noticed, the horse's rhythm never breaking. Careful, Barker, he said, easy, almost pleasant, the way a man says something pleasant right before he says something that isn't. That's my wife you're talking about. Barker's grin faltered. Just a fraction. Didn't know you two'd. Now you do. Nathaniel didn't stop the wagon. Didn't so much as slow it. Good day to you. Addie kept her chin up, her hands folded, her face as still as she could make it, though inside her nerves were going like a struck bell. She didn't look back at Barker. Didn't give him the satisfaction. Are you all right? Nathaniel asked, quiet, once they were past. I've had worse said to me in one letter than that man managed in one sentence, Addie said, and was pleased distantly to hear her own voice come out steady. I'll survive, Mr. Barker. Something that might have been pride flickered across Nathaniel's face. Whitmore really was a fool, he said again. And this time Addie actually laughed, short and surprised, the sound of it loosening something tight in her chest. "You'll wear that sentence out, before the year's done." "Doubt it. Some things bear repeating." The mercantile was cooler than the street, dim and crowded, with the particular clutter of a place that sold a little of everything. Mr. Simmons, thin, spectacled, looked up as they came in, and something in his expression shifted the moment he registered, who was walking beside Nathaniel Cole. "Morning, Nathaniel." Pause, careful, curious. "And this'll be Addie," Nathaniel said, before the man could finish the question in whatever shape he'd been planning it. "My wife." The word landed strange in Addie's ears every single time. Strange, and she was beginning to notice, less unwelcome than it had been 3 weeks ago. Simmons's eyebrows rose. "Didn't know you'd." "Word travels slow out here, apparently," Nathaniel said, mild as milk, already turning to the shelves like the matter was fully settled, and not worth further comment. Addie busied herself with the fabric bolts, while the two men talked supplies, and it was there, hands running over a length of blue calico, that she overheard two women at the counter behind her, not gossiping unkindly, just talking, the way women in a small town talk about anything new that's walked into their midst. Heard she came all the way from Boston, for Whitmore of all people. Poor thing. Man didn't even give her the courtesy of a proper look before he sent her back. Well, seems Cole's given her better than that. Seems so, though it's a strange business, isn't it? Housekeeper 1 week, wife the next. Addie's hand stilled on the fabric. She hadn't thought, until that exact moment, about how strange it must look from the outside. How quickly the story could turn, in careless hands, into something less kind than the truth actually was. She turned, chin lifted, and found both women watching her, with open, unhidden curiosity, not unkind exactly, but not entirely friendly either. "Good morning," Addie said, pleasant and clear, pitched exactly loud enough to carry. "I don't believe we've met. Addie Cole." The name came easier than she expected, standing there, saying it out loud for the first time to strangers. "And you're right, it is a strange business. Though I'd wager most marriages out here started stranger than mine, one way or another." One of the women blinked, then slowly smiled. "That they did, dear. That they did. It wasn't friendship yet, but it was something." A door left ajar instead of shut. They were nearly done at the mercantile, the wagon half loaded, the last of the list crossed off, when Addie noticed him. A man she didn't recognize, standing across the street near the bank, in clothes too fine for a working town like Larkspur, watching. Not watching the street in general the way a stranger new to town might. Watching her, specifically, with a kind of careful, patient attention that made the hair on her arms rise, before she understood why. "Nathaniel!" She kept her voice low, touched his sleeve. "Do you know that man?" Nathaniel followed her gaze. His expression didn't change much, but something in his posture did. A subtle straightening, a readiness that hadn't been there a moment before. Never seen him. The man didn't approach, didn't tip his hat, didn't smile, didn't do any of the small polite things a stranger does, when he means no harm. He simply watched, for one long moment, and then turned, and walked into the bank, unhurried like a man, with all the time in the world, and nowhere urgent to be. "Strange," Addie murmured, and told herself it was nothing, a stranger passing through. Larkspur had a bank. Banks had business with men from elsewhere. There was nothing in it, and yet, later, loading the last of the flour sacks, she heard Simmons mention it to another customer, not quite quiet enough, asking around about a Marsh girl come out from Boston recently. Wanted to know did anybody know where she was staying. Addie's hands went still on the sack of flour. Nathaniel, a few feet away, hadn't heard. Was still talking to Raphael about the wagon's back wheel, which had started to squeak somewhere between the ranch and town. She should tell him. She knew she should tell him right then, standing in the dust outside the mercantile, with the sun sliding toward afternoon, and a stranger's careful, patient gaze still sitting cold on the back of her neck. But it was probably nothing. Probably just a man with business in a bank, asking idle questions the way strangers sometimes did. Probably. She climbed up onto the wagon seat instead, folded her hands in her lap the way she had that very first day, and told herself firmly that whatever it was, it could wait until she understood it better herself. She did not yet understand how wrong she was, but the wagon rolled on, out past the edge of town, back toward the mountains and the ranch and the small, hard-won piece she'd started, despite everything, to build for herself, and somewhere behind her, in a town she'd only just begun to trust. A man in a fine coat wrote something down in a small leather notebook and did not yet come any closer. Not yet, but soon. The stranger's name, Addie would learn soon enough, was Josiah Pratt. But she didn't know that yet. Not on the ride home, from town, flour sacks shifting in the wagon bed, Nathaniel's shoulder a warm and steady presence beside her on the bench seat. She only knew there'd been a man, watching, writing something down in a small leather notebook like she was a line item in somebody's ledger. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself that for 4 days, because that was how long it took him to find her again. It happened at the Mercantile. Second trip into town that month, this one for thread, and a length of oilcloth Addie needed for the kitchen table, which had started to warp at one corner. From years of neglect nobody had gotten around to fixing. Nathaniel was 2 doors down at the smithy. Raphael had stayed back at the ranch, working the new calf crop, which meant Addie was alone, which meant, she would think later, that whoever had been watching her had chosen his moment with care. The bell over the door hadn't even finished ringing when she felt it, that same crawling sensation from 4 days before. She turned. He was younger than she'd expected. Not old enough to be the grandfatherly type of debt collector she'd half imagined in her worst moments, the ones who showed up at doors in Boston, with folders and flat, apologetic voices. This man was maybe 40, clean-shaven, coat too fine for larkspur dust, exactly like before, except this time he wasn't watching, from across the street. This time he was 3 feet away. "Miss Marsh," he said it pleasantly, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it cruel. Addie's hand found the edge of the counter, held it. "I don't believe we've met," she said. Her voice came out steadier than her pulse felt. Good. That was something. Josiah Pratt. He tipped his hat, slow, deliberate, a performance of manners, with nothing warm behind it. "I've come a long way to find you." "Have you?" Not a question. She wouldn't give him a question. "From Boston." He let that sit a moment, watched her face for something. She refused to give him anything to watch. "Your father sends his regards." Because there it was. The thread pulled. Her father. Everything in her went tight and cold at once, and for one dizzying second the Mercantile shelves tilted sideways, thread spools and tin cans, and burlap sacks all swimming together, and the thought landed hard and fast. Don't you dare. Not here. Not in front of this man. She breathed. Once. Slow. "My father is in Boston," she said. "I am not. I don't see what business that is of yours, Mr. Pratt." "It's considerable business, actually." He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Considerable enough that I've spent 3 weeks in this godforsaken territory tracking you down." "You should be flattered. That's a great deal of effort for one young woman." "Flattered." The word came out flat as a slap. "I'm not flattered, Mr. Pratt. I'm alarmed, which I suspect was your intention." Something flickered across his face. Respect, maybe, or annoyance at being read so quickly. "Your father owes a considerable sum," he said, dropping the pleasantries all at once, like a man setting down a heavy bag he was tired of carrying. "To a gentleman I represent. A gentleman with considerable patience, Miss Marsh, and considerably less patience left than he once had." "What does that have to do with me?" "Everything," Pratt said, "because the debt comes due, and your father has nothing left to pay it with. Nothing." He paused, let the word sit. "Except you." The floor didn't tilt this time. It dropped. She didn't remember, later, exactly how she got out of the store. Some part of her had gone very cold and very mechanical, the way it had on the platform that first day, the part of her that could hold a conversation, pay for thread, say a polite goodbye, while the rest of her stood somewhere off to the side, screaming into a void nobody else could hear. Because her father. Because the letters home she'd sent, careful and cheerful, telling her mother she was safe, settled, doing well, none of it had said anything about this. About a debt. About a man named Pratt with a fine coat and cold eyes, and a proposition she hadn't even let him finish saying out loud. Except he'd said enough. Enough that she understood, standing on the boardwalk outside the mercantile, with her thread forgotten in a paper sack, exactly what he'd come here to offer. Marriage. To some man in Boston she'd never met, some gentleman, Pratt had called him, like the word still meant anything, after what he'd just done with it. A marriage that would erase her father's debt. A marriage that would, in Pratt's careful phrasing, resolve the family's difficulties once and for all. And underneath that, underneath the whole ugly shape of it, one thought kept surfacing, kept dragging itself back up no matter how many times she tried to push it under. Whitmore. Whitmore, who'd sent for her, met her, no, never met her, had he. Never once looked her in the eye at that station. Never gave her a single reason beyond a letter full of cold, careful words. I regret to inform you. What if he'd been paid to write it? What if the whole humiliation on that platform hadn't been about her at all? Not her education, not her temperament, not one single thing that was actually true about who she was, but about clearing a path. For this, for Pratt. For a debt she hadn't even known existed, until 4 minutes ago in a dusty mercantile 2,000 miles from home. She made it around the corner of the building, before her knees actually did give out. Not far. Not dramatically. Just enough that she had to put a hand against the rough wood siding, and breathe once, twice, 3 times, counting the way her mother had taught her to count, when the panic came up too fast to argue with. Addie. Nathaniel's voice. Close. Alarmed. She looked up. He was crossing the street toward her at something just short of a run, and whatever was on her face must have told him everything he needed to know, before she said a single word, because by the time he reached her his hands were already up, already reaching, stopping just short of touching her like he wasn't sure if she'd want that yet. What happened? He said. Not a question. A demand, low and urgent. There was a man. Her voice came out thin. She hated how thin it came out. In the store. He knew my name. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Held. What man? Pratt. Josiah Pratt. She made herself breathe again. Made herself say the rest of it, because if she didn't say it now she thought she might not manage to say it at all, might just let it sit and rot in her. He says my father owes money. A great deal of money. To someone in Boston. And he's come to... Her voice cracked. She hated that too. He's come to collect. Using me. Something went very still, and very dangerous in Nathaniel's face. Using you how? Marriage. The word tasted like ash. To a man I've never met. To settle the debt. For a moment Nathaniel didn't say anything at all. Just stood there, jaw working, hands still hovering an inch from her shoulders like he was fighting some instinct to pull her against him, and hadn't decided yet whether that was his to do. Where is he? Nathaniel said finally. Quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting would have been. Nathaniel. Where? You can't. She caught his sleeve. Held on. You can't just, he hasn't broken any law. He's a debt collector with a proposal, that's all it is on paper, and if you go in there and put your hands on him, wasn't planning to shake his hand. Nathaniel. He stopped, looked at her. Whatever he saw in her face made something in his shoulders drop, just slightly, the fight banking down without going out entirely. He's inside the mercantile, Addie said, quieter now. Or he was. I don't imagine he's still there. Men like that don't linger where they've already gotten what they came for. Which was? To frighten me. She said it plain because it was true, and because saying it plain seemed to take some of its power away. He's succeeded. I'd rather not give him the satisfaction of also watching you get yourself arrested defending my honor in the middle of Larkspur's Main Street. That, finally, got something that wasn't quite a smile out of him. Small, grim, but there. Fine, he said. We go home. But Addie, he caught her hand this time, held it, and his palm was warm and solid and steady in a way that made her realize how badly her own was shaking. This isn't finished. Not until I understand what we're dealing with. No, Addie agreed, and let him lead her back to the wagon, her legs still unsteady beneath her, her mind still racing in ragged circles around one single unbearable question. Did Whitmore know? Did Whitmore know what he was clearing a path for when he wrote that letter? She didn't have an answer. Not yet. The ride home was quiet in a different way than the ride into town had been. Not comfortable. Not the easy silence they'd built up over a month of shared suppers and shared work. This silence had teeth in it. Tell me everything, he said. Nathaniel said finally, when the town was well behind them, and there was nothing but scrub and sky and the long empty road ahead. Word for word, far as you can remember it. So she did. Told him about the coat too fine for Larkspur, the notebook from 4 days before, the careful pleasant cruelty of your father sends his regards. Told him about the debt, the gentleman in Boston, the marriage proposed like a business transaction because that was apparently exactly what it was. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. That was one of the things she'd learned about him in a month of living under his roof. He listened the way some men only pretended to, actually taking in what was said instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The wagon wheels turned. Dust rose behind them, hung gold in the afternoon light, settled slow. You think it's connected, he said finally. To Whitmore. I don't know what to think. Addie stared straight ahead, at the road, at the mountains, at anything that wasn't his face, because she was afraid of what she'd see there, if she looked. But it's a strange thing, isn't it? A man travels across half a continent for a bride he's never met, meets her exactly once at a train station, doesn't so much as speak to her, sends her a letter instead, and not 2 months later, a debt collector from her own hometown shows up asking after her by name. Could be coincidence. Could be. Addie's hands twisted together in her lap. I don't think it is, though. I think Mr. Whitmore was paid to reject me, Nathaniel. I think the whole humiliation on that platform was never about me at all. I think I was simply... Her voice caught. She forced it steady. I think I was in the way of a plan, and the plan required me to be alone. Vulnerable. Easy to collect. You're not easy to collect, Nathaniel said, low, fierce, surprising her with the heat in it. Not anymore. Addie looked at him then, really looked. His jaw was set, his hands white-knuckled on the reins in a way that had nothing to do with the horses, who were walking placid and unbothered, sensing none of the tension riding above them. Nathaniel, she said carefully, you can't fight a debt with your fists. This isn't Barker outside the saloon. This is money. Lawyers, maybe eventually. This is a different kind of trouble than the kind you're used to handling. Maybe. Something in his jaw ticked. Or maybe it's exactly the same kind. Man threatens something that's mine, I deal with it. Doesn't much matter what shape the threat takes. The word landed, before either of them seemed fully prepared for it. Mine. Addie felt her breath catch, felt heat rise up her neck that had nothing to do with the sun. I'm not yours, Nathaniel Cole, she said, quiet, though something in her voice had gone soft in a way she hadn't intended. We had terms, remember? Name only. No obligation. He didn't look at her, kept his eyes on the road, jaw still tight, but something in his shoulders had eased, just slightly, like a man who'd said more than he meant to, and wasn't sure, yet whether he regretted it. Terms can change, he said, quiet, almost too quiet to hear, over the wagon wheels. Addie didn't answer that, couldn't really, because something in her had gone tight, and warm and terrified all at once, and she didn't trust her voice not to give away more than she was ready to give away. Not with Pratt's cold, pleasant face still fresh in her mind, not with her father's debt hanging over her like a blade she hadn't even known was there. So she said nothing, and the wagon rolled on toward the Bar C, carrying two people who had just, without quite meaning to, admitted something neither of them was ready to name out loud. That night, Addie couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark of her small room, the daguerreotype of her family a pale ghost shape on the crate beside her bed, and turned Pratt's words over and over until they'd worn grooves into her mind she couldn't seem to smooth back out. Your father sends his regards. She thought of her father's hands. Once steady, once sure, a shipbuilder's hands, hands that had built something real and lasting before the business failed, and the coughing started, and the hands went thin and shaking instead. She thought of her mother, taking in mending by lamplight, her eyes going bad, from the close work, never once complaining, where Addie could hear. She thought, did they know? Did they know what kind of man Whitmore's advertisement had really come from? Did they know, when they'd urged her to answer it, that somewhere behind the careful, respectable words about a good Christian household and steady prospects, there was a debt and a plan and a daughter being quietly, carefully spent? She didn't want to believe it. She lay in the dark and told herself over and over that her parents loved her, that whatever had happened, they couldn't have known, wouldn't have sent her 2,000 miles into a trap with open eyes. But some small, cold part of her, the part that had gone very quiet and very still on that platform a month ago, the part that noticed things and filed them away and didn't let itself be fooled twice, that part wasn't so sure. She would write home, tomorrow, demand the truth however ugly it turned out to be. She didn't know, yet that the truth, when it finally came, would be uglier than even her quiet, careful part had feared. 2 days passed. Long, watchful days, Nathaniel keeping closer to the house than usual, Raphael's rifle never far from the kitchen door, where it had never once needed to be before. Addie found, in that strange watchful stretch, that fear had a way of clarifying things, of stripping away the polite fictions two people tell themselves, when they're not yet ready to look straight at what's between them, because she noticed things now she hadn't let herself notice before. The way Nathaniel's eyes found her, first thing, whenever he came in, from the fields, checking, she realized that she was still there, still safe, before he let himself relax into the rest of the evening. The way he'd started, without either of them commenting on it, walking the fence line closer to the house instead of the far pastures, keeping the Bar C's edges tighter, smaller, more watchable. He was protecting her, not because his pride demanded it, not because a man was supposed to, but because, and this was the thought that kept returning at odd moments, over supper, over the wash line, over nothing at all, because he wanted to. It was on the third day that he took her out to the corral, mid-afternoon, work done early for once, and gestured toward the far rail, where a horse stood alone, apart from the others, wild-eyed and trembling despite the stillness of the day. Found her 2 weeks back, Nathaniel said, caught in barbed wire out past the north fence. Legs healing, but she won't let anybody near her. Not me. Not Raphael. He glanced sideways at Addie. Thought maybe you'd have better luck. Why would I have better luck? Because you talk to things gentle? He said, simple as that, like it was an obvious fact he'd been observing for weeks without saying so. The way you are with the hens. The garden. You don't rush anything into trusting you. Just wait it out. Addie felt something warm bloom in her, unexpected at being seen, that clearly by a man who said so little most days. I've never gentled a horse in my life, Nathaniel. No time like now to start. She approached the mare slow, the way you'd approach anything wounded and frightened. No sudden moves, voice low and even, hands visible and open at her sides. The horse's ears flattened, eyes rolled white at the edges. She took 2 steps back, favoring the hurt leg, and Addie stopped, where she was, patient and simply talked. Nonsense, mostly, about the weeds in the garden, about Raphael's stew, about nothing important at all, just the low, steady sound of a voice that wasn't asking for anything. It took an hour before the mare let her within 10 feet. It took 3 more days before the mare let her touch the injured leg. Nathaniel watched from the fence some afternoons, arms crossed over the top rail, saying nothing, just watching with an expression Addie couldn't quite read, and found herself more and more wanting to. "You're good at this," he said one evening as she finally got a hand flat against the mare's trembling neck and held it there steady until the trembling eased. "I'm patient," Addie said. "That's not the same thing as good. Might be the same thing out here." He came off the fence, crossed the corral slow, stood beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cooling evening air. "Patience is a kind of good, where I come from." The mare shifted. Didn't spook, just shifted, testing the new closeness of two humans instead of one, and settled again. "She trusts you," Nathaniel said, quiet. "She's starting to. Same thing most days." He reached out, slow, and laid his own hand alongside Addie's on the mare's neck, not touching her hand, exactly, just close enough that she could feel the heat of it, close enough that something in her went tight and bright all at once. "Nathaniel," she said low. "Addie." She should have stepped back. Some correct, proper, Boston-bred part of her knew she should step back, should put polite distance between herself and a man who was, on paper, nothing more than an employer, a convenient fiction, a name she wore for the town's benefit. She didn't step back. "Pratt hasn't come near the ranch," she said instead, because it was easier to talk about danger than about whatever this was. Standing in the gold evening light, with a healing horse between them, and his hand an inch from hers. "Maybe he's given up. Men like that don't give up." Nathaniel's voice had gone rough. "They wait, regroup, come back sharper. That's not comforting. Wasn't trying to comfort you, was trying to be honest with you." He turned then, and the mare, sensing the shift in energy, took a slow step back, unbothered now, grazing at the corral's edge like the crisis of trust had genuinely passed. "I don't want to lie to you, Addie. Not about this. Not about anything. That's a strange thing to say to a woman you're pretending to be married to. Maybe I'm tired of pretending part of it," Nathaniel said, and the words landed heavy and quiet between them, and Addie felt everything in her go still, waiting, hoping, terrified of hoping. "Which part?" she managed. He didn't answer with words. He reached up, slow, giving her every chance to step back, to say no, to end it before it started, the way he'd given her every chance, since the very first day in the wagon, laying out terms she could refuse. She didn't refuse. She stood very still, heart hammering, and let him tuck a loose strand of hair back behind her ear, his thumb grazing her cheek for one impossible second, before he drew his hand back like he'd surprised even himself. "That part," he said low and rough. Addie couldn't breathe properly for a moment. Just stood there, the mare grazing peacefully beside them, the whole enormous Arizona sky going gold, and rose above the corral fence, and felt something in her that had been braced and guarded since the moment she'd read Whitmore's letter finally start to loosen. "We should go in," she said. Her voice came out unsteady. "Supper." "Should," Nathaniel agreed. Didn't move. Neither did she. Not for a long moment. But eventually they did. Word came on a Tuesday, carried by one of the Hendricks hired hands on a lathered horse, who didn't stop long enough to properly water him, before turning back the way he'd come. Tom Hendricks had been thrown reshoeing a green colt. Broke his leg bad enough the doctor had been sent for from town, and with only 2 hands left to run 300 head of cattle, and a wife trying to nurse a fevered, cursing husband besides, the Hendricks place was, by the rider's account, coming apart at every seam it had. Addie was elbow deep in bread dough when Nathaniel relayed it, standing in the kitchen doorway, with his hat still in his hand. "They'll manage," he said, though something in his voice suggested he didn't quite believe it. "Ranchers out here always manage." "Managing and thriving aren't the same thing, Nathaniel." Addie wiped flour from her hands, already turning the problem, over the way she turned, over everything, quick, practical, no wasted motion. "How far is it?" 8 miles. 5. "Because I'm going to bring them supper, and bread, and whatever help 2 more hands can offer, until Tom's back on his feet, or they've hired someone proper." Nathaniel studied her a long moment, something working behind his eyes, that wasn't quite surprise, and wasn't quite pride, but sat somewhere close to both. Raphael can drive you over. I don't need driving, Nathaniel. I need a wagon and directions. You'll get both, he said. But you're not going alone. Not with the roads the way they've been lately. Raphael drives. I'll finish here and follow after. She didn't argue. There wasn't time to argue, and some part of her, the part that had learned these past weeks when a man's caution came from control and when it came from care, understood the difference now well enough not to bristle at it. The Hendricks place, when they reached it, was smaller than the Bar C, and considerably more chaotic, chickens loose in the yard, a milk cow lowing unmilked and unhappy at the fence, and Mrs. Hendricks herself standing in the doorway, with the particular gray, hollow look of a woman who hadn't slept properly in 2 days and didn't expect to for several more. Addie. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. Relief and exhaustion tangled together past separating. I didn't send for. You didn't have to. Addie was already climbing down from the wagon, already reaching back for the baskets Raphael had loaded, bread still warm, from the morning, a jar of the garden's first good tomatoes, a length of clean linen, because a woman never quite knew what a sickroom would need, until she was standing in the middle of one. Show me where he is. Then show me where the milking's falling behind, because that cow is not going to wait politely for either of us to finish being polite about this. Something in Mrs. Hendricks's face cracked. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, some exhausted, grateful thing caught between the two. You don't have to do this, she said again, weaker this time, testing whether the offer might still be withdrawn, if she pushed at it. I know I don't. Addie set the baskets on the porch rail, already rolling her sleeves. I'm doing it anyway. That's rather the whole point of neighbors, isn't it? Nobody has to. Everybody does. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, Addie in the kitchen and the sickroom by turns, Raphael, and once he arrived, Nathaniel out with the cattle and the milking and the dozen small broken things a ranch accumulates, when its owner's laid up in bed with a splinted leg and a fever he was too stubborn to admit was worse than he let on. It was full dark by the time Sarah Hendricks, she'd insisted on the given name somewhere in the exhausted middle of the afternoon, the formality worn away by shared work the way formality always was, finally sat down at her own kitchen table, with a cup of coffee Addie had pressed into her hands. I don't know how to thank you, Sarah said quiet, staring into the cup like it held more than coffee. We'd only just met at Founder's Day. You didn't owe us anything. I didn't think anyone owed me anything either, Addie said, sitting across from her, her own hands raw, from the day's work, her own exhaustion sitting warm and honest in her shoulders. Turned out I was wrong about that. This whole territory's been proving me wrong about a great many things lately. Sarah looked up, something knowing in her tired eyes. That's what this land does, I think, she said. Takes everything you thought you knew about how the world works and asks you to learn it over again. Different rules out here. Harder in some ways. Kinder in others. Kinder how? Boston wouldn't have sent a near stranger 8 miles with bread and clean linen, Sarah said, simple as that. Boston would have sent condolences. Card, maybe, if we were very lucky. She reached across the table briefly and pressed Addie's flower and work-roughened hand with her own. Out here we send ourselves. It's the only currency half of us have got, some seasons. And it's worth more than money most days if you ask me. Addie thought about that the whole ride home, Nathaniel quiet and tired beside her on the wagon bench, the mountains black shapes against a sky gone thick with stars. We send ourselves. She thought of Boston, of drawing rooms and calling cards, and a carefully calibrated distance kept between families, who might, in a kinder world, have simply helped one another without keeping score of the debt. She thought of her own family's ledger, the real one, the ugly one, the one Pratt had come 2,000 miles to collect on, and understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly what she preferred instead. This ledger, if it could even be called that. Bread traded for nothing, expected nothing, returned in whatever coin a neighbor had to give, when her own turn of trouble came round. She realized, no longer merely surviving in this territory. She was starting one small unasked for kindness at a time to belong to it. The letter from Boston arrived 9 days later. Addie recognized her mother's handwriting on the envelope before she'd even fully crossed the yard to where Raphael stood holding the ranch's mail, and something in her clenched tight, with a feeling she couldn't quite name, hope, maybe, or dread, or some tangled knot of both. She waited until she was alone to open it. Sat on the edge of her bed, the same bed where she'd spent that first sleepless night weeks ago, and broke the seal with hands that weren't quite steady. My dearest Adelaide, I hardly know how to begin this letter, and I have started it 3 times already, and torn it up twice. But you deserve the truth, and I have decided, after much prayer, that I owe you that much, however painful it may be. Your father has been unwell with worry these past months, more than his cough alone would explain. There is a debt, Adelaide. One I did not fully understand the shape of until recently myself. Your father borrowed, some years ago, against the last of the shipyard's assets, from a man in the city, whose patience, it seems, has finally run out. I do not know how to say this next part gently, so I will simply say it. When Mr. Whitmore's advertisement came, your father saw in it more than a chance at your happiness, though I have to believe that he wanted that too. He saw a way to satisfy at least part of what was owed. I did not know this at the time, Adelaide. I want you to believe that, but I have since learned that a payment was made to Mr. Whitmore's associates around the time of your departure, and I no longer know what to believe about any of it. A man came to the house 3 weeks ago, well-dressed, very polite. He asked a great many questions about you, about your character, about where you might be found. Your father spoke with him alone in his study for the better part of an hour. When I asked what was discussed, your father would not say. Only that it was business and that I was not to worry. I am worried, Adelaide. I am worried I have failed you in some way I do not yet fully understand. I am worried that the man you married, or the situation you find yourself in, did not come to you honestly. Please, if there is any truth in what I fear, write to me. Tell me you are safe. Tell me you are cared for. Your loving mother. Addie read it twice. Then a third time, slower, her hands going cold around the paper the way they'd gone cold around Whitmore's letter on that station platform weeks and a whole lifetime ago. A payment was made to Mr. Whitmore's associates. So it was true. All of it. Whitmore hadn't rejected her because she was too educated, too outspoken, too anything at all. He'd been paid. Paid to clear the way for exactly what had happened next. For Pratt. For the debt. For a daughter quietly, carefully spent to satisfy a ledger she'd never even known existed. And her father had known. Not everything, maybe not the full ugly shape of it, but enough. Enough to sit in his study for an hour, with a well-dressed stranger, and say nothing to his own wife about what was discussed. Addie set the letter down on the crate beside her bed, next to the daguerreotype of her family, her father's face, still handsome in that old photograph, still whole, still trustworthy, in a way that felt like a lie now, a small preserved lie sitting in a frame she'd carried across half a continent, because she'd loved him. She sat very still for a long time, didn't cry, though the temptation of it pressed close, familiar as an old habit. Something in her, that had been soft and hopeful just 9 days ago, standing in a corral at sunset, with Nathaniel's thumb against her cheek, went hard and cold and determined instead. Fine, she thought, fine. If I am to be spent, I will not be spent quietly. She found Nathaniel at the barn, mending a section of fence that had come loose in the wind. He looked up as she approached, and whatever was on her face must have told him, again, everything he needed to know before she said a word. Addie, my mother wrote. She held the letter out, hand steady now, the shock of it hardened, over into something more useful. Read it, please. He read it standing, jaw tightening line by line, and by the time he reached the end his knuckles had gone white around the paper's edge. Your own father, he said, low, disbelieving. Apparently, Addie's voice came out flatter than she expected. It seems I come from a long line of men willing to spend me for the right price. Mr. Whitmore, my father. I suppose Mr. Pratt is simply the latest in the queue. Don't. Nathaniel's voice cracked, through the flatness like a whip. Don't talk about yourself that way. Not in front of me. Not ever. Addie looked up at him, startled by the heat in it. It's the truth. It's not. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and this time he didn't hesitate before he reached for her, both hands finding her shoulders, holding on like he could physically anchor her against the current of her own despair. You're not a debt to be settled, Addie. You're not a line in anybody's ledger. You hear me? It doesn't matter what I hear, Nathaniel. It matters what Pratt believes. What the man in Boston believes he's owed. Then we make them believe something different. His grip tightened, just slightly urgent. You're not going anywhere. Not back to Boston. Not to some stranger's house to settle a debt you didn't make and don't owe. I don't care what your father signed his name to. You can't simply decide that, Nathaniel. This is bigger than the Bar C. Bigger than Larkspur. Addie's voice shook despite herself. This is money and lawyers and men who have spent years learning how to collect what they believe is theirs. Then I'll learn to fight men like that. His eyes held hers, dead serious, dead certain. Whatever it takes, however long it takes. You're not going back there, Addie. Not while I've got breath in me to stop it. Something cracked open in Addie's chest, wide and terrifying, and warm all at once. Why? She whispered. Why does it matter so much to you? Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. His thumb moved, slow, against her shoulder, an absent gesture that felt anything but absent. Because I told myself I wasn't going to do this again, he said finally, rough. Wasn't going to let myself care about somebody enough, that losing them would take the ground out from under me. Told myself that the day I buried Clara. Told myself I'd built high enough walls, that nothing was getting past them ever again. And you climbed right over them anyway. His voice broke just slightly on the last word. Without even trying. Just showed up on a train platform with a letter in your hand, and a chin held higher than anybody rejected like that has any right to hold it, and I was done for before I even knew what was happening to me. Addie's breath caught. Nathaniel. So no, he said, cutting her off, gentle now instead of fierce. I can't simply decide that you're staying. Not by myself. Not without you wanting the same thing. But I can tell you I'll fight for it. Whatever it takes. If you'll let me. For a long moment, Addie just looked at him. This careful, guarded man who'd offered her nothing but honest terms since the day they met, who was standing here now, with his walls and visible pieces around his feet, asking for something he clearly hadn't let himself want in years. I'll let you, she said, quiet, certain. The words landing in the space between them like a promise neither of them was taking lightly. I'll let you, he kissed her then, careful at first, asking the way he asked everything, giving her every chance to step back. She didn't step back. She rose up onto her toes instead, hands fisting in the front of his shirt, and kissed him back with all the fear and fury and unexpected hope that had been building in her for 6 weeks, since the moment a stranger, with storm-gray eyes, had stopped his wagon on a dusty street and asked if she was waiting on someone. She wasn't waiting anymore. She'd found him. Founder's Day arrived 12 days later, and Larkspur transformed itself for the occasion. Bunting strung between storefronts, tables set up along the main street for the picnic, a wooden platform hammered together for dancing once the sun went down. The whole town seemed to exhale. Into it, ranchers and their families pouring in. From every direction, the ordinary hard-scrabble business of frontier life set aside for one bright, hopeful day. Addie had a new dress for the occasion, blue silk, a gift from Bess Bellwether at the dress shop, who'd taken one look at Addie's story and declared, with the particular authority of a woman who'd seen 40 years of frontier romance unfold in her fitting room, that she was not letting Nathaniel Cole's wife attend Founder's Day in anything less than her finest. Not that you need silk to shine, dear, Bess had said, pins in her mouth, working the hem. But it doesn't hurt. Addie stood in front of the small mirror in her room now, the blue silk settling around her like something out of a different life entirely. Not the frightened woman on the platform, not the quietly furious woman reading her mother's letter, but someone new. someone chosen, someone who'd built, out of rejection and threat and fear, a life that was actually, finally, hers. Nathaniel was waiting in the main room when she emerged, and the look on his face when he saw her made every careful stitch of Bess's work entirely worth it. "You look," he started, and then the way he had that very first day at the station seemed to lose the rest of the sentence entirely. "You said that once before?" Addie said, smiling despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "You didn't finish it that time either. Some things are hard to finish saying out loud." He crossed the room, took her hand, brought it briefly to his lips in a gesture, so unlike his usual plain-spoken self, that Addie felt her breath catch. "You look like the best thing that's happened to this ranch since I bought it. That finish it well enough?" "It'll do," Addie said and laughed, and let him lead her out to the wagon. The celebration, for the first several hours, was everything Addie had quietly hoped it might be. Bess introduced her to half the women in the county, a warm, welcoming blur of names and faces, ranchers' wives, a schoolteacher with kind eyes, an older woman named Mrs. Hendricks, who'd apparently despaired of Nathaniel Cole ever marrying at all, and seemed, by the end of 10 minutes' conversation, thoroughly delighted to be proven wrong. "We'd all but given up on him," Mrs. Hendricks confided, watching Nathaniel across the gathering, deep in conversation with two other ranchers about cattle prices. "Too married to that land of his, we thought. Then you turned up, and look at him now. Can't keep his eyes off you for longer than a minute together." Addie glanced over, found it true, Nathaniel's gaze drifting to her again, and again across the crowded gathering, warm and unhurried, like he was simply reassuring himself she was still there. It was Bess, again, who steered her toward the pie tables, insisted really elbow-hooked through Addie's like the matter had already been decided, where a broad, unhurried man in a tin star was working his way through a slice of dried apple pie with the focused patience of someone who'd learned long ago never to rush a good thing. "Sheriff Coates," Bess said. "Larkspur's law, such as it is. Ezra, this is Addie Cole." Coates looked up, studied her a moment the way Addie was coming to understand men out here studied things, not rude, exactly. Just thorough, like a man checking a fence line before he trusted his cattle to it. "Heard about you," he said. "Whole town's heard about you, matter of fact. I imagine that's not entirely to my credit. Wasn't meant as an insult." He forked up another bite. "Man sends for a bride, and doesn't have the backbone to meet her at the train. That's a story that tells itself, ma'am. Doesn't need much help from gossip. You knew Mr. Whitmore then?" "Knew of him. Never cared much for what I knew." Coates set his plate down, wiped his hand on his trousers, before offering it, plain and businesslike. "Nathaniel Cole's a good man. Known him going on 6 years now. Buried one bad season right alongside him, back when the drought had half the county thinking about giving up and going home. He doesn't talk about that season. Doesn't talk about most things." Coates said it without unkindness, the way Raphael might have said it. The way it seemed half the men in this territory said the hardest truths, plain, unhurried, no weight thrown behind the words, that the words didn't already carry on their own. "You've done something to him, though. He's standing straighter than I've seen him stand in years." Addie felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "I only came here to be a housekeeper, Sheriff." "Sure you did." Something dry moved behind his eyes, the ghost of a smile that never quite made it all the way to his mouth. "And I'm only here for the pie." Bess laughed, delighted, and towed Addie onward toward the next introduction. Somewhere behind them, a fiddle began tuning up, one long note bending slowly toward the next, and the whole gathering seemed to lean toward the sound like a field of something turning toward the sun. Addie glanced back once, over her shoulder, at the broad, unhurried man in the tin star, already returning to his pie like the whole exchange had been nothing at all. She wouldn't think of that conversation again for weeks, not until a night far darker than this one, standing on a station platform, with her wrists still marked, watching that same star catch lantern light, as its owner turned a forged document, over in his hands, unhurried, thorough, exactly the way he'd studied her the very first time. But that was still weeks away. Tonight there was only pie and bunting, and a fiddle finding its key, and a rancher's gaze finding hers again, and again like he couldn't quite help himself. For the first time since the mercantile, since Pratt's cold pleasant voice, since her mother's letter, for the first time in weeks, Addie let herself believe fully that this might actually be a happy ending taking shape around her. She was wrong to believe it quite yet, but she didn't know that. Not as the afternoon wore on into evening, not as the musicians took the platform and began tuning their instruments, not as lanterns were lit against the coming dark, and Nathaniel appeared at her side, hand extended, the whole gathering softening into gold light and easy music. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Cole?" "You may, Mr. Cole." He led her out among the other couples, one hand warm at her waist, and Addie let herself sink into it completely, the music, the closeness, the particular happiness of being wanted by someone who'd never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. "I've been thinking," Nathaniel said, quiet, close to her ear, as they turned slow among the other dancers, "about what I said before, about fighting for this. And I don't just mean fighting off Pratt, or whoever's behind him." His hand tightened at her waist. "I mean, I want this to be real, Addie, not name only. Not terms and conditions we agreed to on a wagon bench the first day we met. I want you to be my wife because you choose it, because I choose you, however long it takes to make that true in every way that matters." Addie's eyes went hot and bright, and this time she let a single tear escape, unashamed, because it was the good kind, the kind she'd never once let herself have, since that platform. "Yes," she said, before he'd even fully finished asking, because some part of her had known the answer for days now, maybe weeks, maybe since a corral at sunset, and a thumb brushing her cheek. "Yes, Nathaniel, I choose it too." He was smiling, really smiling, the kind that changed his whole face when the music faltered. Not stopped, faltered, the fiddle catching wrong, a few bars dragging out of time, and Addie turned, following the sudden ripple of unease moving, through the crowd near the edge of the gathering, and felt everything in her go to ice. Pratt, standing at the edge of the lantern light, coat as fine, and out of place, as ever, a folded paper in one gloved hand, and beside him stood Charles Whitmore. The crowd's murmur rose and thickened, a low current of confusion and curiosity moving through the gathered families, as the music died out entirely, the musicians unsure whether to continue or wait out whatever was clearly, visibly, about to happen. Whitmore looked worse than Addie had somehow expected. No, she corrected herself. She'd never actually seen him before at all, had she? Not once. He'd sent his rejection by letter, and never shown his face. This was, in fact, the very first time she had ever laid eyes on the man who'd once been meant to be her husband. He looked uncomfortable, sweating despite the cool evening. His eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. Pratt, beside him, looked perfectly, chillingly composed. "Miss Marsh." Pratt's voice carried, deliberately, across the whole gathering, pitched exactly loud enough for every rancher, and wife and curious child to hear every word. "I'm glad to find you here. Saves me the trouble of a ranch visit. Say what you've come to say, Mr. Pratt." Addie kept her voice steady, through sheer force of will, felt Nathaniel's hand find the small of her back, solid, present, refusing to let her stand alone in front of the whole town. "And then leave. I intend to, once this business is concluded." He unfolded the paper in his hand, with slow, theatrical care. "I hold here a letter of guardianship, executed by your father, transferring legal responsibility for your welfare, and your marital arrangements to the gentleman I represent. Your father's debt, Miss Marsh, is considerable. This document settles it. In exchange, you are to return with me to Boston." A gasp moved through the nearest onlookers. Bess Bellwether's hand flew to her mouth. "That is not a legitimate document," Addie said, though her voice shook now, despite everything, despite Nathaniel's hand steady at her back. "I am a grown woman, Mr. Pratt, 23 years of age. No man holds guardianship over me. Not my father, and certainly not some stranger you claim to represent. The law may see it differently, given the debt attached. Pratt's smile didn't waver. But I'm not an unreasonable man, Miss Marsh. I'd rather this be settled quietly. Tonight, before matters become unpleasant. She's not going anywhere with you. Nathaniel's voice cut across the gathering, low and hard. The whole storm Addie had glimpsed in him, since that very first day now fully visibly present. She's my wife. Are you certain of that, Mr. Cole? Pratt's gaze slid, deliberate, toward Whitmore, who flinched under the sudden attention. Because my understanding, Mr. Whitmore's understanding, is that the marriage arrangement between yourself and Miss Marsh was never formalized, never legal, a convenient fiction for the town's benefit, was it not? The murmur in the crowd sharpened into something almost audible now, whispers passing hand to hand through the gathered families, and Addie felt the whole careful world she'd built over the past 6 weeks tilt sharply beneath her feet. Because it was true, they'd never actually married. Not in front of a preacher, not with any paper that would hold up against whatever paper Pratt was waving in his gloved hand. That's, Addie started, and found she had no ready answer, no clever rebuttal, nothing but the cold, sick knowledge that Pratt had found the one crack in the foundation, and driven straight into it in front of the entire town. I thought as much. Pratt's smile widened, thin and satisfied. So you see, Miss Marsh, there's nothing legally binding standing between you and your obligations. Nothing at all. Whitmore, beside him, finally spoke, his voice rough, unsteady. Addie, I never wanted it to come to this. I was only ever meant to break the engagement. That was all I was told. I didn't know about the rest of it. I swear to you, I didn't know what he intended. Quiet, Pratt snapped, and Whitmore went silent immediately, shrinking and something in. That small, ugly exchange told Addie everything she needed to know about who truly held the power between the two men standing before her. Nathaniel stepped forward, putting himself fully between Addie and Pratt, and his voice, when it came, was low enough that only those closest could hear it, and cold enough that even Pratt's composure flickered. You'll take one more step toward her, Nathaniel said. And paper or no paper, you'll answer to me first. Pratt's eyes narrowed. For one long, suspended moment, the whole gathering held its breath, musicians silent, lanterns hissing softly overhead, the entire town of Larkspur watching a confrontation none of them had come out tonight expecting to see. Then Pratt folded the paper back up, slow, unhurried, tucking it into his coat, with the same careful theater he'd used to produce it. I'll not make a scene at a town social, he said, smooth again, composure sliding back over his face like a mask replaced. But this matter is far from settled, Mr. Cole. Miss Marsh. A small, cold nod toward Addie. I'll be at the hotel through the week. I'd suggest you use that time wisely, because if this isn't resolved amicably, I promise you, the law will resolve it far less gently on your behalf. He turned. Whitmore hesitated one beat longer, looking at Addie, with something that might, in a better man, have been genuine shame. I'm sorry, he said, quiet just to her. I never meant for it to go this far. Then he followed Pratt out, through the parting crowd, and the whole gathering exhaled at once, a rush of whispers and shocked murmurs rising up to fill the space where the music had stopped. Addie stood frozen in the lantern light, Nathaniel's hand still fierce and steady at her back, the whole town's eyes on her, the whole careful shape of the life she'd built, over 6 weeks suddenly, terrifyingly uncertain. Because Pratt was right about one thing. There was no marriage certificate, no paper standing between her and whatever claim he intended to press. Nothing but a promise made in a corral at sunset, and a kiss, and the fierce protective set of Nathaniel Cole's jaw. It would have to be enough. It would have to be enough because there was no more time left to make it anything more. Addie. Nathaniel turned her gently to face him, his eyes searching hers in the lantern light, urgent, apologetic, fierce all at once. I should have married you proper weeks ago. Should have gone to the preacher the moment I knew what I wanted this to be. I'm sorry. I let my own fear cost us the one piece of paper that would have stopped that man cold tonight. It's not your fault, Addie said, though her voice shook badly now, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining out of her all at once, leaving something cold and frightened in its place. Neither of us could have known he'd come here, tonight, in front of everyone. No. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. But we know now, and I'm not giving him another single day to work with. What do you mean? I mean, Nathaniel said, low, urgent, already pulling her toward the edge of the gathering, toward the wagon, toward whatever came next. We're finding the preacher. Tonight, before that man has one more hour to plan his next move. Behind them, the whispers of Larkspur's Founders Day crowd rose and swelled into something that would, by morning, be the talk of the entire county. The mail-order bride, the mysterious debt collector, the rancher who'd stood between her, and a stranger's claim in front of the whole town. But Addie, hurrying beside Nathaniel, into the cooling dark, wasn't thinking about the whispers. She was thinking about Pratt's cold, composed smile as he'd folded that paper away. This matter is far from settled. He hadn't looked, she realized, like a man who'd been beaten. He'd looked like a man who'd simply moved his opening piece, and was already 3 moves ahead, waiting to see what she and Nathaniel would do next. And somewhere behind them, in the crowd still murmuring in the lantern light, Charles Whitmore stood alone for one long moment, watching the wagon pull away, his face carrying an expression that might, if anyone had thought to look closely enough, have been read as warning. But nobody was looking at Whitmore anymore. Everybody was watching Nathaniel Cole's wagon disappear into the dark, carrying his almost wife toward a preacher's door, and a piece of paper that both of them now understood with sudden and absolute clarity might be the only thing standing between Addie Marsh and a train she'd sworn, on a station platform 6 weeks ago, she would never willingly board again. The preacher's house sat dark. When they reached it, no lamp in the window, no answer to Nathaniel's knock, and for one terrible stretched-out moment Addie thought, of course. Nothing tonight is allowed to be simple. A neighbor finally leaned out, from next door, sleep still creasing her face. Reverend Cutter's out at the Higgins place, she said. Mrs. Higgins is birthing early. Won't be back till morning, likely. Nathaniel's jaw worked. Addie felt his hand tighten around hers. Morning, then, he said, low, like a man forcing himself to accept a delay he didn't trust. Morning? Addie agreed, though something cold had already started uncoiling in her stomach. Some instinct she didn't have a name for yet, just a feeling. A held breath, a door left open somewhere she couldn't see. They took a room at the boarding house instead of driving 5 miles home in the dark. Nathaniel's decision? Quiet and firm. No room in his voice for argument. Separate rooms, he'd said, proper as church, and Addie hadn't argued, though something in her had wanted badly to not be alone tonight. She should have listened to that wanting. She lay awake a long while, listening to larkspur settle around her. A dog barking somewhere, a door closing, boots on the boardwalk below her window, ordinary town sounds that meant nothing, and everything all mixed together, until she couldn't tell which was which anymore. She thought about Pratt's cold, composed smile. She thought he looked like a man 3 moves ahead. She should have gotten up, should have walked down the hall, and knocked on Nathaniel's door, and said, plainly, something is wrong. I can feel it. Don't leave me by myself tonight. She didn't, because she was tired, because the day had been long and frightening, and she told herself, the way frightened people always tell themselves right, before the worst happens, that surely nothing more could go wrong before morning. She was wrong. The knock came just past midnight. Soft, almost polite. Addie woke instantly, heart already hammering, before her mind had caught up to why. She sat up in the dark, listening. Another knock, and a voice, low, unfamiliar, pitched to carry no further than the door. Miss Marsh, a message from Mr. Cole, which should have warned her right there. Because Nathaniel would never send a stranger to knock on her door at midnight. Because he'd have come himself or sent Raphael, someone she knew, someone with a face she trusted. Except she was half asleep and frightened, and some traitorous hopeful part of her thought, maybe the preacher's back early, maybe it's good news, maybe. She opened the door. Two men. Not Pratt himself, she registered that, with a strange detached clarity even, as a cloth came up fast, over her face, sweet and sharp and wrong, her lungs burning, before she understood what was happening. Her hands clawing uselessly at forearms like iron. Nathaniel. She tried to scream his name, got half a syllable out, before the world went soft, and gray and very far away. She woke to the rattle of wheels on hard-packed road, her wrists bound loose, but bound, her head pounding like something had taken a hammer to the inside of her skull. Dark still, or dark again. She couldn't tell how much time had passed, couldn't tell anything except that she was moving, fast, away from Larkspur, away from Nathaniel, away from every plan they'd made 12 hours ago in a corral full of gold evening light. Pratt sat across from her in the carriage, perfectly composed, hands folded, like a man on his way to an unremarkable business meeting. "You're awake," he said. "Pleasant. Cold. Good. I'd rather you understand what's happening than sleep through it." "Where?" Her voice came out cracked, dry. She hated how weak it sounded. "Where are you taking me?" "The station. There's a night train through at 2. You'll be on it." He checked a pocket watch, unhurried, like this was routine, like he'd done this exact thing to some other frightened young woman a dozen times before and found the process entirely unremarkable. "By the time your Mr. Cole realizes you're gone, you'll be well past the county line. He can't fight paperwork with a shotgun, Miss Marsh, however much I imagine he'd like to try. He'll come after me. He'll try." Pratt's smile didn't waver. "But I've arranged a small distraction. Should keep him occupied for some time. More than enough." Something in Addie went to ice. "What kind of distraction?" Pratt didn't answer. Just looked out the carriage window at the dark scrub rolling past, and said nothing at all, and that silence was somehow more frightening than any answer could have been. At the Bar C, an hour earlier, Raphael Ortiz woke to the smell of smoke. Not gradual. Not a slow curl under a door. All at once, sharp and wrong, and he was up, and moving before his mind had fully caught the alarm his body already understood. The barn. Flames already climbing the near wall by the time he reached the yard, orange light throwing long crooked shadows across the corral. The horses screaming. That terrible high sound animals make. When fire's involved, a sound that gets into a man's chest and doesn't leave for days. Fuego! Nathaniel! El Granero! Nathaniel came off the boarding house porch 3 streets away at a dead run 20 minutes later, having ridden hard the moment Raphael's messenger reached town, and found Raphael already fighting the blaze, with buckets and grim, practiced efficiency, most of the horses already freed, and circling the yard in wide frightened loops. They fought the fire together for the better part of an hour. Got it contained, before it took the whole structure, though the near wall was a ruin of blackened timber by the time the last flame died under Nathaniel's boot. Raphael caught sight of something, as the smoke cleared, half buried near the corral fence. A broken lantern, oil-slicked rag still wound around its base, tossed there deliberate, careless, by men who hadn't cared whether anyone saw what they'd left behind. He didn't have time to think much on it. Not yet. It was only after, soot-covered, hands blistered, chest heaving, that Nathaniel straightened up and looked around the yard, and some instinct, some cold certainty, made his stomach drop straight through the ground. "Where's Addie?" he said. Raphael's face, already grim, went grimmer. "She's not here," Raphael said slowly. "She was in town. With you. She was in her room. At the boarding house." Nathaniel was already moving toward his horse, exhaustion forgotten, every muscle in him gone taut and cold. "I left her there an hour before this started." Raphael's eyes met his, and neither man needed to say the word out loud. "Diversion." "Go," Raphael said. "I'll finish here. Go." Nathaniel was already gone. The Larkspur station stood dark, and near empty at 1:30 in the morning. One lantern burning at the ticket window, the platform stretching out pale and silent under a sky thick with stars. The same platform, Addie realized with a lurch, that had nothing to do with the carriage's motion, where this entire impossible chapter of her life had first begun. Full circle, Pratt walked her toward the platform, with one hand firm at her elbow, not rough exactly, but absolute, a grip that left no room for argument. Behind them, one of his men carried her trunk, her actual trunk. She realized with a fresh jolt of violation. Someone had gone to the ranch and packed her things, while she was unconscious in a carriage, had touched her mother's silver hairbrush and her family's daguerreotype, and folded them away like items on an inventory. "You've thought of everything," she said, low, bitter. "I generally do." Pratt checked his watch again. "Train's due in 20 minutes. We'll wait inside out of the cold." The station agent, a different man than the one who'd been so brusquely unkind to her that first day, an older fellow with tired eyes, looked up as they entered, took in the scene, with the particular wariness of a man who'd seen enough late-night station business to know when something wasn't right. "Help you folks. 2 tickets east," Pratt said, smooth, already reaching for his billfold. "The lady's not feeling well. Will want to board promptly." The agent's eyes flicked to Addie, to the faint red marks at her wrists, where the bindings had chafed, mostly hidden now beneath her sleeve, but not entirely. "Ma'am," he said, careful testing. "You traveling of your own will?" There was the crack, the opening. Addie felt her heart slam against her ribs, felt every ounce of fear in her body reorganize itself, all at once, into something sharper, something useful, because she'd spent 6 weeks learning this territory, learning its people, learning that a woman's voice, spoken plain and steady in front of witnesses, carried weight here in a way it never quite had back in Boston's polite drawing rooms. She was not going to waste that lesson now. "No," she said, clear, loud enough to carry, through the whole small station. "I am not traveling of my own will. This man drugged me in my sleep, and has kept me bound for the better part of the past hour." Pratt's hand tightened hard on her elbow. "She's confused," he said quickly, smooth composure cracking, just slightly at the edges. "A fever. She's been unwell." "I am not unwell," Addie said, cutting through him, and turned to face him fully, chin lifted, the exact same posture she'd held on this exact platform 6 weeks ago, when the whole world had first tried to fold her up small and send her back east like unwanted freight. "I am not confused, and I am not getting on that train." "You don't have a choice, Miss Marsh." Pratt's voice had gone hard now, the pleasantness stripped entirely away. "This document," he fumbled in his coat, pulled out the same folded paper from Founder's Day. "This document grants full legal authority." "Show it to me," Addie said. Pratt hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but she saw it. "There's no need. Show it to me," Addie said again, louder. "Or explain to this man, and to the sheriff I intend to fetch the moment you refuse, exactly why you won't." Because that was the thing about liars. She'd learned, really learned, deep in her bones, watching her own father's careful silences unravel in her mother's letter. Liars hated daylight, hated scrutiny. A confident man with a legitimate document doesn't flinch at being asked to produce it twice. Pratt flinched, just barely, but the station agent saw it too. "Sir," the agent said slowly, setting down his pen, "I believe I will fetch the sheriff, just to be certain everything's proper." "That won't be necessary," Pratt said, too fast. "I believe it will," Addie said. The sheriff, a broad, unhurried man named Coates, who Addie had exchanged a few pleasant words with over the picnic tables at Founder's Day, and who now looked considerably less pleasant, dragged from his bed at nearly 2 in the morning, arrived within 10 minutes, boots half-laced, hat crooked. He looked considerably less reluctant once Addie finished explaining. Once Pratt, cornered now, produced the document with visibly shaking hands, and Coates held it up to the lantern light, turning it, frowning. "This here's supposed to be a father's signature," Coates said slowly. Authorizing guardianship transfer. That is correct, Pratt said, some of his composure clawing its way back. Executed properly in Boston, before witnesses. Funny thing, Coates squinted at the paper. I had occasion, few years back, to see a genuine Massachusetts guardianship transfer. County business, nothing to do with you. Had a seal on it. Notary's mark. This, he tapped the paper. Doesn't have either one. Silence. Addie felt something in her go very still. Very sharp. That's an oversight, Pratt said. Easily remedied. Can't remedy a forgery, son? Coates said, not unkindly. The way you'd correct a boy caught in a lie he hadn't quite thought all the way through. Only thing that remedies a forgery is a judge, and a jail cell. This is absurd. Pratt's voice had gone thin now, brittle, the careful pleasant mask entirely gone. I represent a legitimate creditor. There is a genuine debt owed. Maybe there is, Coates said. Debt's a civil matter, though. Kidnapping a grown woman in the night and drugging her, that's criminal, and that's what I've got standing in front of me right now. Best I can tell. Behind them, the station door banged open. Addie turned, and every fear still sitting cold in her chest simply dissolved, vanished, burned away like fog under sun. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, soot still streaked across his face and forearms, chest heaving from a hard ride, eyes finding hers across the small station, with an intensity that made the whole room, briefly, disappear around the two of them. Addie, I'm all right, she said, and found, saying it, that it was true, truer than she'd expected it to be. I'm all right, Nathaniel. He crossed the platform in furlong strides and pulled her into him, one arm banding tight around her back, his other hand cradling the back of her head like he needed to feel, with his own palm, that she was real and whole in here. I should never have left you alone, he said, rough into her hair. Should have. You didn't leave me, Addie said, pulling back just enough to look at him. I handled it, Nathaniel. Look. She gestured slightly toward Pratt, who stood pale and cornered between the sheriff and the ticket window, the forged paper still hanging limp in Coates's hand. I handled it myself. Something in Nathaniel's face shifted, surprise, first, and then something deeper. Pride, unmistakable, warm enough that Addie felt it settle somewhere close to her heart. Of course you did, he said, quiet, like it should have been obvious all along. Should have known better than to worry. Coates cleared his throat, nodding toward the soot still dark on Nathaniel's arms. Ryder come through a while back, said there'd been a fire out at the bar. See that you're doing, Pratt? Pratt said nothing, which Addie had learned was its own kind of answer. We'll see what your men have to say about that, once we've got them rounded up, Coates said. Arson's a serious charge in this territory, on top of everything else. You'll want a very good lawyer, son. Coates arrested Pratt on the spot, fraud, forgery, unlawful confinement, and once his two hired men were run down, before dawn near the county line, arson besides, charges enough to keep the man well occupied for a good long while, and Addie found, watching him led away in cuffs toward the little Larkspur jail, that she felt no triumph in it. No satisfaction, even, just a kind of tired relief, the particular exhaustion of a threat finally, fully removed. It was Whitmore, who arrived at the sheriff's office the following morning, unannounced, hat in hand, looking like a man who hadn't slept. I want to make a statement, he said to Coates, though his eyes found Addie where she sat with Nathaniel near the window and stayed there. About Pratt, about the payment, about everything. He told it plain, once Coates had him seated with pen and paper, how a man claiming to represent a Boston creditor had approached him weeks before Addie's arrival, offering a substantial sum to break the engagement quietly, no explanation required beyond a simple letter. How he told himself it was a kindness in some twisted way, sparing a young woman a marriage to a man who plainly hadn't wanted her regardless. How he hadn't understood, not fully, not until Founder's Day, what he'd actually cleared the way for. I'm not asking forgiveness, Whitmore said at the end, still not quite meeting Addie's eyes. I don't imagine I've earned it. I only wanted the truth on record. For your sake, Miss Marsh, whatever that's worth to you now. Addie was quiet a long moment. It's worth something, she said finally. Not everything, but something. Whitmore nodded once and left Larkspur on the very next eastbound train. Not sent away in cuffs, but leaving all the same, disgraced enough in the town's eyes, that Addie suspected he'd never find welcome anywhere in the territory again. She didn't watch him go. She'd spent enough of her life watching men leave, deciding things about her, without her in the room. She had better things to do with her mourning. News of the fire had traveled through the county faster than Addie would have believed possible, faster even than the news of Pratt's arrest, and by the second morning after the wedding date was set, wagons had already begun arriving at the Bar C, before Addie had so much as finished her coffee. She stood on the porch, still in her work dress, and watched them come, the Hendricks wagon first, Sarah driving it herself now, that Tom's leg had mended enough to sit propped in the back giving directions nobody particularly needed. Behind them, Mr. Simmons from the Mercantile, a wagon bed loaded, with lumber he'd apparently decided, without asking anyone's permission, that the Bar C would be needing. Behind him, 3 more ranching families Addie recognized only vaguely, from Founder's Day, and behind them, unmistakable even at a distance, the broad, unhurried shape of Sheriff Coates, off duty for the day, and already rolling up his sleeves, before his wagon had properly stopped. "What is all this?" Addie said, when Nathaniel came to stand beside her, equally bewildered. "Barn raising," he said slowly, like a man working out a puzzle in real time. "Didn't ask for one. Doesn't look like asking was required." Sarah Hendricks climbed down first, crossing the yard, with the easy confidence of a woman repaying a debt she'd been waiting for the chance to repay. "You fed my husband and milked my cow for 3 days without being asked," she said, by way of greeting, hands already going to her sleeves. "I believe I mentioned out here we send ourselves. Well, here we all are." Addie felt something rise in her throat that had nothing to do with sawdust and everything to do with the particular ache of being, for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, entirely and unquestionably wanted somewhere. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "Don't say anything," Coates called, already hauling lumber off Simmons's wagon like he did this every week of his life. "Just point us at the wall that needs raising and stay out from underfoot. Man my age doesn't get many chances to feel useful with a hammer instead of a badge." The work went fast, the way frontier work always seemed to go once enough hands turned to it. Men on the framing, women in a rotating shift between the kitchen and the water barrels, and more than once the framing too, because Addie noticed within the first hour that Sarah Hendricks could swing a hammer, as true as any man on the property, and nobody thought to stop her. The air filled with the steady, cheerful violence of saws and mallets, sawdust catching gold in the morning light, voices calling measurements back and forth across the yard like a language all its own. Addie herself moved between it all, running water, running bread, running the particular quiet errands that kept a dozen hard-working people fed and steady through a long hot day, and found, somewhere around mid-afternoon, that she'd stopped thinking of herself as a guest in this life at all. She was simply living it. Bess Bellwether arrived past noon with a wagon full of pies that put Addie's own baking thoroughly to shame, and settled onto an overturned crate near the water barrel, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who considered pie delivery a form of skilled labor equal to any hammer swing happening 20 feet away. "You've done something to this town, you know," Bess said, watching the framing rise, watching Nathaniel up on the crossbeam directing 2 other ranchers, with the easy authority of a man who'd built this exact structure with his own hands once already. "Larkspur wasn't always like this. Folks kept to themselves more before. I've done very little, Bess. I only tried to survive what landed on me." "That's not nothing, dear." Bess patted the crate beside her, an invitation, and Addie sat, grateful for the momentary rest. Surviving loud enough that other folks notice, that's its own kind of gift to a place. Gives the rest of us permission to stop pretending we're managing everything alone too. Addie thought of Pratt's cold, composed voice in the Mercantile, of her father's silence in his study, of a whole life back in Boston built on the careful, exhausting fiction that a person managed everything alone, or else admitted failure. She thought of a barn rising, plank by plank, on the goodwill of near strangers who'd decided, without being asked twice, that her trouble was theirs to share. "Maybe that's the real difference," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. "Back home, everyone guards what's theirs and calls it dignity. Out here we've all had our turn needing the barn raised." Bess finished for her gentle. "Sooner or later, land like this finds a way to remind every last one of us we can't do it alone. Best folks learn that lesson early and kindly from neighbors. Rest of us learn it late and hard from grief." Her eyes flicked, briefly, toward the 3 weathered crosses just visible on the rise behind the house, and Addie understood, without either of them saying Clara's name, exactly what kind of hard lesson Bess meant. By the time the sun dropped low and gold across the valley, the barn's new walls stood framed and half-planked, solid enough that Nathaniel, coming down off the crossbeam at last, dust and sawdust thick in his hair, simply stood for a long moment looking at it like a man who couldn't quite reconcile the ruin of 2 nights before with the sturdy, sunlit thing now standing in its place. "Wasn't sure this'd rise again so fast," he admitted low, just to Addie, as the last of the wagons began the slow process of loading up for the ride home, calls of farewell, and "see you at the wedding," Cole carrying easy across the yard. "Neither was I," Addie said, "but I'm learning not to be surprised anymore by what this place can rebuild, given enough people willing to lift together." Nathaniel's hand found hers, roughened now with a full day's honest work, and neither of them minded one bit. "For days," he said. "Then a wedding, a real one." "For days," Addie agreed, and watched the last wagon roll out toward the darkening road, carrying home a county's worth of people who had, without a single one of them making a show of it, simply decided that the Bar C's trouble was worth an afternoon of their own hard-won time. She thought, watching them go, that this, more than any single dramatic rescue, more than any confrontation on a lantern-lit platform, was the truest measure of how far she'd come. Not that she'd been saved, but that she'd been welcomed. The wedding took place 4 days later, in the small church at the edge of town, Reverend Cutter presiding, back from the Higgins place, with news of a healthy baby girl, delivered safe despite the early scare, which struck Addie as a fitting kind of symmetry, new life arriving safe in the same stretch of days that had nearly cost her everything. It was a small gathering. Raphael, scrubbed clean of soot, and looking uncharacteristically formal in a pressed shirt. Bess Bellwether, dabbing her eyes, before the ceremony had even properly started. Mrs. Hendricks and half a dozen other ranch wives who'd, in the space of 2 months, become something Addie hadn't expected to find, so far from Boston friends. A community that had watched her stand her ground on a station platform, and in a mercantile and, finally, in front of the whole town at Founder's Day, and had decided, somewhere along the way, that she belonged among them. Addie wore the blue silk again, the same dress from Founder's Day, and found she didn't mind one bit, that it wasn't new. Some things were better worn twice, she thought, once for the promise and once for the keeping of it. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Cutter said, and Nathaniel's kiss, when it came, held none of the careful restraint of that first questioning kiss in the moonlight weeks before. This one was certain. Whole. Promise finally, fully kept. They rode back to the Bar C, as the afternoon light went gold across the valley, the barn's blackened wall already half rebuilt, Raphael and 2 hired hands, from a neighboring ranch having worked, through the past 4 days to see it standing whole again, before the newlyweds returned. Addie noticed the mare first, the wild one, the one she'd spent, that patient weak gentling, standing calm now at the corral rail, weight fully back on her once injured leg, healed clean through. She climbed down from the wagon, still in her wedding silk, and crossed to the fence, and the mare came to her without hesitation now, without fear, nosing gentle at her open palm. Nathaniel came up beside her, quiet, watching. "She trusts you," he said, "fully now, not just starting to." "Same thing happened to me," Addie said, not looking away from the horse. "Somewhere in the last 2 months. Started as barely trusting anyone at all. Ended up," she glanced at him, smiling, something soft and certain settling into her. "Ended up here, whole, trusting completely." Nathaniel's hand found hers on the fence rail, warm and sure. "Whatever comes next," he said. "Storms, debts, fools with forged papers, whatever it is. We'll meet it standing. Together." "Together," Addie agreed. Behind them, the ranch spread out gold, and solid in the last of the light. A house rebuilt, from someone else's tragedy. A barn rebuilt, from someone else's cruelty. A garden coming back to life in soil that had once grown a dead woman's dreams and now, slowly, was learning to grow Addie's instead. She thought of that first afternoon, the platform, the letter. "I regret to inform you," she thought. "He was right to reject me in the end, though not for any reason he understood at the time. Because if Whitmore had wanted her, she'd have married a stranger who never once looked her fully in the eye and lived a life measured out in obligation instead of choice. Instead, she'd been rejected and humiliated and nearly sold twice, over by men who saw her as a debt to be settled rather than a woman to be known. And she'd survived all of it, not by being rescued, not by waiting quietly for someone else to fight her battles, by standing again and again on whatever ground she'd been given and refusing to be moved from it until she'd chosen herself exactly where she wanted to stand. The sun dropped low behind the western mountains, spilling gold and rose across the Bar C's rebuilt barn, its healing garden, its two people standing hand in hand at a fence rail, with a whole unwritten life stretching out ahead of them. Addie Marsh, Addie Cole now in every way that mattered on paper and in truth both, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder, watching the light fade slow and gentle over land that had finally, fully, become home. Not because anyone had given it to her, because she had claimed it herself 1 inch at a time.